On the 26th of March 1947, just under 2 years since the Second World War in Europe had come to an end with the German surrender to the Allies and Red Army, a notorious collaborator of the war walked out to his execution. He strolled out to the execution post inside of Pankrac Prison's courtyard, a place where many prominent Nazi collaborators and evil men would meet their final end. He was to be pole hanged, and to the Czech people, this man was the worst of the worst. He was someone who had betrayed his nation, and because of this, he would pay the ultimate price. During World War II, Alois Kriz was involved in broadcasting propaganda and working as a journalist for the Nazis. He was even known for his voice and the fact he preached what the Nazis wanted in attempts to demoralise the resistance which was growing in Czechoslovakia. But he was executed by pole hanging for his crimes. But what else did he do? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Alois Kriz was actually born in Germany, in the Hamburg region in February 1911, and his parents were both Czech. His father served in the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War, and he then moved in with his mother to Czech lands and attended school. He went on to attend university in Prague, but never graduated and never finished his studies. But during the Second World War, he would become infamous inside of Czechoslovakia. He worked as a journalist and would work as a propaganda broadcaster. In 1939, Adolf Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, and he had the year before been gifted the Sudetenland region of the country, which he annexed into his empire. Britain and France agreed to this, and they wanted at the time to appease Hitler in an attempt to avoid another global conflict or world war by simply giving in to Hitler's demands. Kriz was someone who the Nazis appealed to, being an ethnic German in the eyes of the Nazis, and someone whom they wanted to take land in Czech regions. He had a career as a radio editor, but later the Nazis wanted to take the whole country of Czechoslovakia, and they would do this, and they then carved up the nation. In the very same year, Alois Kriz had a personal tragedy, as his wife gave birth to their second son, but the birth was very traumatic, and she then died months later, and Alois had to spend weeks in hospital himself for his grief after collapsing. In 1941, Kriz, who was in favour of the Nazi ideology, became a propagandist and journalist on Czech radio. He would do regular shows on the radio, which propagated the Nazi policies, and he became, in the eyes of the Czechs, one of the most hated people across the land. He was actively collaborating with their enemy, and people were being repressed heavily and were kept in terrible conditions by senior Nazis such as Reinhard Heydrich. It was regular for Czechs to pass by the hanging bodies of their friends and neighbours as the Nazis terrorised people. They needed to keep people as productive as possible to ensure that they continued to work hard in the Czech armaments factories as they were arming the German war effort. Alois Kriz began to devote himself to his work for the Nazis, and on the radio he prepared and delivered weekly political reports, press reviews, and he translated articles from the Nazis. He also delivered propaganda lectures, which were heard by many people, and much of these contained anti-Bolshevik and also anti-Semitic messages, and he claimed in one of these, and I quote, "The time is coming when the nation is willing to believe. It is fortunate there is a cadre of nationalists who warned it, and who wanted it to see, even under the former regime. This fact must be valued highly. The fight of these nationalists against the Jews was not based on superficial hatred without argument, but was underpinned by deep conviction that this fight is necessary if the national community is not to suffer a catastrophic fate." He was saying exactly the same sort of things as men such as Joseph Goebbels were. He specifically said about Hitler that, and I quote, "Adolf Hitler saved the old world of Christian civilization, the highest values of human existence, the lives of nations threatened by the mortal danger of unimaginable destruction. Therefore we, the seers, join our prayers with the greatest thanksgiving, in the deepest trust in the genius of the man whom Providence made the saviour of the world, of truth and goodness." Kriz continued to work, and he wrote for newspapers under a pseudonym, criticising Czech governmental figures. But as the Second World War turned against the Germans, even in May 1945, Kriz was still speaking on the radio, but he was considering an escape attempt. In May 1945, he slipped out of his radio station via a side entrance in Prague and was swarmed by groups of people, and he was grabbed and seized by Czech people. He was branded a traitor, and they then began to shout at him and strike him, and Kriz tried his hardest to get away, but he could not, and with a bloodied face, he was then led towards a police station, but he was at this time attacked again. Within a few days he was then sent to Pankrac Prison, and was left there for some time before his trial began. At the beginning of 1947, he was tried alongside other journalists, and he tried to defend himself, claiming he was silly and naive to side with the Germans. He also tried to downplay what he had done, claiming that no one listened to his shows and that no one cared about his work, but this wasn't effective. In March 1947, Alois Kriz was sentenced to death by hanging for his crime of treason. He wrote briefly in prison that, I quote, "I've been sentenced to death by hanging. I would like to submit a polite request that this sentence be commuted or replaced with a life imprisonment, since my criminal activity did not cause the death of any people. According to the prosecution, I made a very good impression, so there is legitimate hope that I will become a valid member of human society and the Czech nation. I promise to do my best to ensure this." But his appeal for clemency would be rejected. On the 26th of March 1947, Alois Kriz was led from his prison cell to the execution post inside of Pankrac Prison. He was to be pole-hanged, and this method of execution, some claimed, was quicker than using a traditional gallows. Kriz was led up to the 3-metre post, where infamous Nazis such as Karl Hermann Frank and Kurt de Luger were also executed upon. The executioner and his assistant swiftly passed a system of ropes around pulleys at the top and bottom of the post, and they hoisted him off the ground by a chest sling. They also passed a noose around the neck of Kriz and then checked that everything was ready. The executioner's assistant then released a drop, and Kriz plunged down slightly, and the executioner was stood behind on a step, and he quickly forced Kriz's head to one side and tried to manually dislocate his neck. According to reports, the final words of Alois Kriz were "Long live the nation." At the end of the Second World War, there were many people who were condemned to death for their betrayal and treason of their fellow countrymen and civilians by siding with the enemy. Alois Kriz was a man who broadcasted a huge amount of pro-Nazi propaganda, and he was critical of the resistance and those inside of the country who were trying to resist and sabotage. But at the end he paid the ultimate price and was executed as one of the worst Czech traitors of the Second World War. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.